one day after Mandela got elected president, I was told to go up to the Union buildings. I was going to meet Mandela. I'd been assigned to protect him. I remember the conversation he said to me was, I trust you. I trust you with my life.
Etienne, thank you for joining me today. I was looking forward to our podcast and our content for today. We met completely casually at a legal event of all things. And when I found out about your story, I said, I'd love to have you on the podcast. I've personally had a big tie to South Africa and went there for many years to do a project in a community called Kalaci outside of Cape Town. So there's been a strong affinity. So welcome. Thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Gary.
So, and Etienne, what I'd love to start with a little bit is about your upbringing. Like, where did you grow up? What was that like, etc., so that people get to know Etienne as a person a little bit.
Yes, I was born in a small little city. It's relatively small, called Port Elizabeth. The name has changed now, and I'm sorry I can't pronounce that name properly, but it's Gqeberha. And then at a very early age, I went to boarding school in a very special little town called Restraint. Small little town in a large sheep farming community. And that's where I spent all my life as a child. Went to one school there, very special school to me. I go back every now and then for my class reunions, and recently went back for my 40th year reunion. So really special town, but also as I've reflected on growing up there, and also when people ask, how did it come that you worked with Nelson Mandela? I always reflect right back to my childhood days and what it was like then. I was raised in apartheid South Africa. When I was born, Nelson Mandela was in prison already. The little town where I was raised, everything was white. My neighbors, my parents' friends, my friends, my school, the church we went to, my teachers, they were, life was really segregated. And I often say I was oblivious growing up. I was oblivious about apartheid. But I think that just it's not intellectually honest, I think, to say that. It just is a demonstration of how separate we were. Black people lived in squatter camps on the outskirts of town. Their movements were limited by what was known as the pass laws. We had a gardener who used to work in our garden, a black man and a black lady that cleaned our house. And that's the closest contact I had with black people. And I was there till I finished high school. I didn't want to become a police officer. It wasn't my choice. And I often tell people, don't always be too harsh on those who make decisions on your behalf. Because my dad said, my boys are going to the police. So off I went to the police. At the age of 19, I was carrying a gun before I had a driver's license. And I suppose that decision to send me to the police is ultimately what set me on the path to walk at Nelson Mandela's side.
And what was that like to sort of let's call it law enforcement and more generally, Etienne? So I assume your training was more general law enforcement training, and then you went through some sub training to become a bodyguard. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, although I've always been in protection.
Okay.
So after my initial police training in 1985, a group came around to recruit people to go to what was known as the Special Guard Unit. This was when P.W. Botha was still the head of state of South Africa. Now, my brother was 2 years older than me, and he was in the same unit. And also the police college where I was trained in 1985 was also only white students. But when I walked into that room to speak to the recruitment officers, they identified me from some distance and they said, "Are you Van Eck?" And they recognized me because apparently my brother and I look alike. And that's how I made it into the Special Guard Unit. So, and then a relatively intense course after my basic police training. Followed a protection course. And then I started out as a rookie, I would say not bodyguard, but a guard in empty buildings, doing access control to presidential estates and stuff like that. And slowly started progressing through the ranks. And also did a stint in one of the townships outside of Johannesburg at a time when there was a lot of unrest in the country. I was on a course, a leadership course, and they just pulled everyone off the course and sent us into the township outside of Johannesburg. And so I've never arrested anyone. I've never been that classic sort of Bobby on the beat type policeman.
No, and that's probably a good thing considering the work you had to do, because arresting somebody would have had to be very they would have had to get very close to who you were protecting. So
Yeah, I think my police training, of course, we were taught, we did a lot of academic subjects as well, criminal law and all these things. And uh, uh, a lot of the apartheid laws were still in place. Things like, sabotage and, I think the Mixed Marriages Act, prohibiting Mixed Marriages Act was still in place. So I learned about this stuff. And of course, as part of our training, we also saw videos of the unrest, but pretty one-sided. It was only in Canada that I started seeing videos of how the police in the 70s were actually suppressing demonstrations with dogs and guns and shambucks, big things that they would beat protesters with. So sort of again, I always tell people, watch out for the influence government propaganda can have on you, and that can form your mind. And when they show you only one side.
well, and I think that it seems to be consistent with any government that wants a certain reaction out of people. So that all makes sense. And at the end, ultimately, you got a chance to work with Nelson Mandela. So obviously, you started moving up the ranks, etc. How did that come about in the first place?
Well, again, I mentioned earlier decisions made by others on your behalf. I was never the best at anything, Gary. I wasn't the best policeman at anything. But before I got assigned to Nelson Mandela, there was a process in South Africa called CODESA. Nelson Mandela got released, and very soon after that, a multi-party negotiation process known as the Convention for Democratic South Africa started. And I was assigned to protect that process, the inside of the building, not the general policing outside of the immediate area. But in the spirit of multi-party negotiations, we were told that every party that was part of the negotiations would be able to nominate people for the security effort. So myself and a colleague from the ANC headed up what became known as CODESA Security, with a mixture of people from all backgrounds, all political parties, some, in fact, with not much security training. So I think during that process, the African National Congress maybe got to know me a little bit. I'm sure they maybe checked me out, my background. I don't know. But again, one day after Mandela got elected president, I was told to go up to the Union buildings. I was going to meet Mandela. I'd been assigned to protect him. And I remember the day clearly. I was in uniform. I was 28 years old. It's one of I think the last times that I actually wore a uniform. And I walked in there with my commander at the time. And I had a brief meeting, like an introduction to Nelson Mandela. And I remember that conversation. And one of the last things he said to me was, I trust you. I trust you with my life. And, of course, I thought, well, you know, you've never met me. I think he had some background information on me and stuff, but Mandela was a risk taker, so that's probably a little bit of a risk as well. But that's how it came about that I started working with Mandela. And coincidentally, I mean, I actually met him once, very briefly, at CODESA in 1991. And I still have a framed poster, a CODESA poster, with a brief message from Nelson Mandela on it to me.
And Etienne, I'm going to go back to those CODESA meetings for a second, and then I'll go back to sort of after you started working with Nelson Mandela directly. At that time, you were working with an ANC colleague, sort of as part of the protection for those meetings. What was that like? Was that sort of your first interaction working with a colleague from ANC and sort of that direct collaboration?
Yeah, it was the first time we were. I expect they viewed us, regardless of our background and age, as being part of the apartheid regime, the regime that had committed the worst atrocities over the decades before CODESA. My team and I, viewed them as, I don't think we ever used the word terrorist, but these were people that we thought, and probably wrongly so, that they were trained outside of the country, and coming in under the cover of darkness and committing acts of sabotage and stuff that we were hearing on the news when I was in high school. So the level of distrust was pretty high. But again, sometimes when CODESA started, I think I was 24 years old, and it's just, somehow you get to put differences aside. Of course, we had all these political leaders coming to the negotiations, and also senior people, who were guiding and driving the process as well. So I suppose we had examples to follow. But my own senior leadership from the South African police, a lot of them were members of the old guard, and I got no support from them. I thought many times I was standing alone with my team of, young South African police officers. I was, asked to spy on these ANC people, like, to try and get identity numbers. It's similar to the social insurance number. Make notes of the registration plates of the cars that they were coming to every day, what guns are they using and stuff like that. And it wasn't easy, but I declined to do that because, I was caught between, two sides. And I was there every day at CODESA, so it was impossible to not commit to that. And I think eventually my senior commanders sort of were just happy to leave Van Eck over there and that process that is taking place. It wasn't easy to function in isolation,
For sure.
but again, I think that's where my eyes started opening. That these people are just like me.
Yeah, they're people. Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's interesting, and there would have been a very conflicting time for a variety of reasons, right? Like you had sort of, each side with their own interests and coming together. What were some of the things you did to build trust at the time, Etienne, with sort of that ANC colleague or others that you were coming across? Like, because obviously there was a certain period of time where it takes a bit of trust building, and much like you, I'm sure they looked at you and were like, hey, he's a person just like us, and that he's actually a nice guy, and it takes a bit of time to get there, but that soon enough, that's the realization I'm sure they would have come to.
Yeah, team building in those days were, I suppose, different than what they are now. Team building back then, whether it was just in a police team or in a team like that, involved, ideally a fire and lots of meat.
Yeah.
What we call a braai in South Africa, and probably a few beers. Sometimes we'd be at a shooting range as well, and once the guns are away, light the fire. But also in the actual premises of Codesa, we would often get together after a day's work, just sit in the restaurant before we go home, get to know each other a little bit. And I think getting to know each other a little bit is so important when you're trying to unite a team, or like Mandela did, a country. And it's based on the approach that if you get to know somebody, it becomes more and more difficult to treat them poorly. And the opposite is unfortunately true, that it's easy to treat someone really poorly if you don't care about them, and you don't get to know them. And I suppose, reflecting on my time with Mandela, that is exactly what he did. Try to get to know the people of South Africa. And even before I worked with Mandela, I suppose that's an approach that worked for us. And then also myself and my colleague, his name was Jude. Um, he, we, I think, tried as best we could to keep each other informed, to involve each other in decision making. It's sort of, try and live in the spirit of a co-commander
That's right.
setup, which is, what we did with when we were assigned to Mandela as well.
So I'm going to move on to that part now, Etienne. So you met Mandela, they had that first meeting. He said, "I trust you with your life." And then obviously you worked closely with him for the next 2 years. Tell us what was that like now? Because there was obviously that build up and sort of that trust that the ANC had to build around you as well. But now you're actually with the guy, at a, probably one of the most pivotal times in South Africa, if not the most pivotal since in modern history.
I think it was well, for me personally, building on the experience that I had at Codesa, but this was a different ball game. The stakes were a little bit higher. We were protecting an important process with Codesa, but yeah, we were protecting a newly elected Nelson Mandela after decades of apartheid government. And again, we had this distrust between us. And I think one of the important things was a lot of people at the time in the police were talking about the Mandela security team integrating into the South African police because it's a police function. But even that word integrate, was triggering for people because it wasn't seen as them joining the police. It was, in the true sense of a word, an amalgamation of two entities coming together to form the Presidential Protection Unit that would protect Nelson Mandela. And it was tricky, like who's going to do what role. Bringing two groups who had diverse backgrounds. We didn't know exactly what their training was. I expect they had a little bit more information about our training. And then I think what worked for us is respecting what each side brought to the process. Mandela's security team, before he became president, I think they didn't have the resources that we had as being part of the police, but yet they kept that man alive. They kept Mandela alive from 1990 to 1994, when South Africa, at times we thought that country was going to burn.
For sure.
Especially closer to the election in 1993, ultra right-wing party invaded Codesa very violently and disrupted that process for quite a while. A senior leader in the liberation movement, Chris Hani, was assassinated over Easter weekend in 1993. And right up until the election, there were strong allegations, and I think some were actually proven, that the South African police at the time was involved as what was known as the third force, providing weapons and intelligence to the side against the ANC, and that would result in really violent clashes and lots of people dying in the unrest, around South Africa. So it's in that environment that we come together with Mandela's security team, and I suppose I had observed from a distance, on the news and stuff. I'd observed how Mandela operated, and his emphasis on unity over division, and his talk of reconciliation, and also the story of him when he came out of prison, the example that he set. And I think we had this example to follow, because we knew, regardless of our differences and that we didn't know each other, we knew that if anything happened to Nelson Mandela, that country would have been in trouble. And uh, I think that motivated as well us, despite our differences and unknown stuff, to come together and still keep him safe.
And what's interesting, Etienne, for people that are not as familiar with South Africa, they thought sort of, especially the period, to your point that you made earlier, between 1990 and 1994, they kept him alive despite not having all the resources. It was actually a tumultuous time, and it's not like all Black South Africans were united in one front, and it's ANC. In fact, the sort of one of the things that you learn pretty quickly is you had regions that were largely Zulu and regions that were largely Xhosa, and like that they weren't always aligned, and bringing sort of that unity even amongst the Black population was key to actually get to that election results, and that led to clashes of their own well before sort of the election came about, and I think that made that team's job hard even pre-election.
Yeah, and I think Nelson Mandela won the election with an overwhelming majority. I think it was in the 60s. The closest other party was the National Party, which was around 20%. And with that overwhelming majority came an opportunity to misuse immense power. And but Mandela, from when he was released from prison and when he became president of South Africa, was always, even although the country was on a knife edge, he chose the path of forgiveness, nation building, and reconciliation. And Mandela was also a little bit of a risk taker, because as part of his process to bring the nation together, he sought opportunities to build meaningful coalitions, to involve people in what he was trying to do. And in that process as well, really try to get to know the nation. And, as an example of that is probably me. Mandela got to know me. He asked me about my family. And I spoke earlier about, the risk of appointing me, to walk at his shoulder. But it wasn't only me and the other white people on our team. It was also, for instance, people who had really serious fears about the future, white people. We would travel to rural areas and he'd speak to farmers about their fears of land distribution. And again, the country was on a knife edge, especially to the question of land. But he would provide reassurance that now that I'm president, you're not all of a sudden going to be pushed off your farm. Civil servants. The civil service in South Africa in 1994 was predominantly white, and without exception, the entire top structure. But he would reassure white civil servants that there were place for them in the government and their jobs were secure. This doesn't mean that Mandela didn't have the hard conversations when required. I was with him when he went to a room full of predominantly white senior leaders, generals of the South African police, and stamped on them, told them what his expectations were, and that resistance wasn't only futile, it was going to be addressed. So Mandela didn't just always, focus on, you know, the change champions and the opportunities that various coalitions presented for nation building. He also was able to identify resistance and address that. And I talk about opportunities for building coalitions. The Government of National Unity in 1994 is an example of that. For instance, when F.W. de Klerk became a vice president in the Government of National Unity. And another example, probably the most famous example of Mandela, I think, not only taking the risk, but having the vision and the judgment, and identifying opportunities to bring people together. The finest example, I think, is the Rugby World Cup of 1995, when South Africa, for the first time, hosted the World Cup. We were not part of the World Cup in the previous two. The World Cup is held every 4 years. And there's a movie about it. People might have seen that, Invictus. I'm portrayed in that movie, but that's a story for another day, perhaps. But Mandela, right from the outset, threw all his support behind that side. A predominantly white side. In the final against the mighty All Blacks of New Zealand, everyone was white but one, Chester Williams. And not everybody agreed with Mandela that it was a good idea to support the South African all-white, basically, side. But yet he did it. He saw it an opportunity to bring the country together. Rugby is a big sport, but at that time was nothing compared to soccer and what soccer meant, and the following it had amongst the vast majority of South Africans. But he also supported the preservation of the Springbok emblem, which a lot of people see as a really offensive symbol of oppression. But regardless, he supported that team and the retention of that emblem. And then I suppose what some people might say, beyond all expectations, the South African Springboks win that World Cup. And we all know of that great photo with Nelson Mandela and the South African captain, Francois Pienaar, holding with the number 6 on his back, raising that World Cup trophy. I think Nelson Mandela truly captured the imagination of South Africans on that day. And it was a big celebration. But here's the thing as well, and I reflect on this often over, especially watching recent World Cup finals. Perhaps what Nelson Mandela saw, what no one else saw, was a truly representative South African rugby team hoisting that trophy in years to come. And they did it in 2019. Siya Kolisi, the great captain of the South African Springboks, also number 6 on his back, hoists that trophy. And then he does it again 4 years later. And I think that is a demonstration of Mandela's vision and judgment. And I said it was a risk. What if it flopped, right? What if the Springboks were knocked out in the quarterfinals? It could have been a bit of a deflation. But sometimes great leaders who have got good vision and judgment take risks as well.
No, it's a really good point, and I think and for anyone that hasn't watched the movie Invictus, Matt Damon is fantastic at it, and it's there's and obviously Morgan Freeman. Like it's beautiful movie, and get some good perspective of the time. So I think it's worth it. But you were in the front lines. You saw some of this, and perhaps the threats that also came with it. It certainly wasn't an easy job to get that kind of exposure live. You know, you're taking Nelson Mandela to games, all the threats to worry about, and that was a time where the threats were real and probably imminent. So I can't imagine your job would have been easy at that time.
No, it was. Yeah, and just to clarify, I actually wasn't at the final. I expect because of my position, I could have been there. I chose to stay home and watched it with one other person. Watched that final, and then obviously with the rest of the country took to the streets after that. The Invictus portrays the big jumbo jet flying over the stadium in a slightly different light.
Yes.
But that's Hollywood. Invictus does tell a remarkable story.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the threats then, and also how information was gathered and intelligence gathering and the use of that was a lot trickier, a lot more challenging.
Yeah, 100%.
And there were threats, but we did what we had to do based on the situation, and sometimes it wasn't actually uh, a threat of people trying to hurt or kill Mandela. Sometimes the risk arose from people who loved Mandela, massive crowds, people jumping in front of cars, us having to divert. But of course, with a love for Mandela, if I wanted to hurt Mandela, I would form part of a big crowd. And Mandela had a habit of getting really close to the crowd and shaking people's hands. He loved the nation, and with that came threats as well.
And Etienne, just because, like history tends to repeat itself, like looking back on that period, like what do leaders today underestimate how fragile public trust really is, like, compared sort of learning from some of the lessons from Nelson Mandela?
I think I've got various thoughts about that, and the first is what do we mean by trust? What is the content of trust? And for me, I think even when I'm dealing daily with people, or as I lead in my job, but also for leaders of a nation, leading with humanity and compassion is a way of building trust. Because if those aren't there, you can destroy trust and you lose it, and it'll be very difficult to regain. And the same applies when leaders lead with self-interest as their motivator, and when they're not consistent. I can speak a little bit about consistency as well, but also when they are driven by self-interest over the good, or the greater good, and when they look only after their party or their people versus the entire nation. The dangerous thing is when leaders don't care about whether people trust them or not, and how they can push narratives and demonstrate an reckless regard or have a loose relationship with the truth. And we see a lot of that today. But I think there's something to be learned from Nelson Mandela's example. And positive leadership, or any positive example or behavior, tends to be contagious. So if you're a leader and you're setting good examples around the things I've just spoken about, it's going to rub off. But unfortunately, bad behavior can be contagious as well. One thing that Nelson Mandela did, and it's something about the greater good, is he demonstrated the ability to put conscience over heritage. And that is a remarkable trait for a world leader. And again, focusing on the greater good, but also taking the long view, knowing that your job as a leader of a nation is never done.
Right.
And to lead for future generations. And Mandela ends his book, Long Walk to Freedom, by telling a story. It's literally the last paragraph, telling the story of, I've walked the long road to freedom, and I've come to the top of this mountain just to find that there are other mountains. But I stopped for a while, and I take in this beautiful, glorious view. But I can't linger because there's still so much work to be done. And he says, with freedom comes responsibility. And that is seriously really powerful. Mandela also, while I'm speaking about Long Walk to Freedom, tells the story of when he was a kid. They used to ride on the backs of donkeys, bareback, and the donkeys obviously would throw them off. And he says he got thrown into this thorn bush, and he uses the phrase, I lost face in front of my friends. He felt a bit humiliated. And then he said, he makes the point, which I think is relevant today. And he says, to humiliate someone is to make them suffer an unnecessarily cruel fate. And he did that as a leader as well. And then he makes the further point. He says, I learned to defeat my opponents without dishonoring them. And if we see what is happening in the world at the moment, there's something to be said about how Mandela led. And he didn't become that way when he became a leader. He was like that. He started learning these lessons as a kid. He was formed that way.
No, and then it's I have that book on my shelf, Etienne. Also, a highly recommended book, and so much good material in there, and really tells you the formation of a person, how it came about to be. But it is, that is a powerful statement to say, is that you can defeat opponents without being without humiliating, because we ultimately in a democratic system, you have to listen to differing opinions, etc., and win on merit versus simply by being brushed or by winning sort of in a humiliating type way. And just Etienne, this, I could talk about some of your work and Nelson Mandela for many hours, but any before we wrap up for today, any parting thoughts or any leadership skills that you saw Nelson Mandela, or lessons that you learned that you'd think that, before I wrap up with Gary today, I'd love to sort of share with the audience that Gary didn't get a chance to ask, because naturally time flies when you're, when it's such a big topic.
I think the ability for a leader to show compassion is something that will always stay with me. To bring humanity to how you lead, and I'll tell you a personal story about that. In 1999, I emigrated to Canada, and Mandela was no longer president. But I suffered a setback right here in North Vancouver. And I went back to South Africa for that. And Nelson Mandela phoned me out of the blue. He phoned me and he expressed his condolences, spoke to me, about this tragedy. And he said to me, you have the courage to triumph over tragedy. Yeah, and that is a story that will always stay with me. That Nelson Mandela took the time to make that call, really heartfelt, sincere, genuine. Um, and that he remembered me. But and I'll tell another story. Mandela used to tell this story, and I think it's relevant today. He used to tell the story of this young man who lives in a little village in South Africa, and he's looking for, I think, what Mandela described as his perfect wife or partner. And he goes out into the world for what sounded like, years, and meeting all these people, different, business people, people in high places. And he comes back to the little village to see that his childhood friend, who was a young girl at the time, had grown up into this lovely young lady who turns out to be his ideal partner. And Mandela's moral of the story was familiarity breeds contempt. And sometimes we don't see the people or the solutions that we are looking for. And they're right in our midst, but we don't see them because we've taken them for granted. And Mandela never took anyone or anything for granted.
And it's a powerful lesson at the end, because it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to not overlook things that you come across with regularity, and that appreciation is so key. At the end, we'll move to the part of the podcast that we call the rapid fire questions. It's supposed to be fun, sort of interactive, first thing that comes to mind, and like sort of one word answers. So how many languages do you speak?
Afrikaans and English.
What word do you hate, if any?
Fake.
I can appreciate that. What word do you have a hard time pronouncing, if any?
Preliminary. Preliminary.
You did an excellent job. What is your favorite word in any language?
Ubuntu.
And Etienne, I'm familiar with Ubuntu, but I think that it's worth explaining that concept for anyone that doesn't speak the language.
It is it has its origins in African culture or indigenous culture, and it basically captures humanity, interconnectedness, and community. It goes good with me if it goes good with you. Community over individual.
That's right. So important. And what's one word to describe yourself by?
Sensitive.
At the end, it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast today, and thank you very much for sharing your story, your learnings. I mean, it was fascinating to hear sort of your background, but then certainly some of the learnings from Nelson Mandela. So really appreciate you making the time to join us here today.
Thank you, Gary. And one of the reasons I do this is when I walked past Nelson Mandela when he was lying in state in 2013, I made two promises to him. I said, I will try to be more like you, and I will tell the world about you. And this podcast is part of that.
And really appreciate it, Etienne. We'll do our part to try to spread the word.
Thank you very much.